I want to take the next 3 weeks and tell you a story. It's a story that is probably familiar to almost all of you. It's a story that is archetypal in its construction, and by that I mean it's a story that is like other stories that have been told as long as stories have been told. It's a fascinating story. It's an intriguing story. The characters in the story are iconic characters. They're characters that are familiar to us. They appear in different stories in different names. They appear in our experience, in our stories, as different people, but they have the same roles. It's a story of intrigue. It's a story of love and hate. It's a story of loyalty and betrayal. It's a story of grace and the limits of grace. It's a story that is so provocative in its nature, it presses into some of the most difficult questions that we can possibly consider in our entire lives. For example, it provokes us to wrestle with the question of how much control do we actually have over our own lives? How much free will do we have, and how much of our life is actually predetermined? That we are just acting out in a narrative that has already been written. Do we have actually free choice? Are we sovereign individuals? Are there things that we can choose to do that are so unanticipated, so unexpected, that even God is caught off guard? Another question that this story raises is the question of intent, the question of motive. I think we've all experienced times in our life where something goes badly, but we didn't intend for it to. We intended for it to be good and beneficial and profitable, but something happens and it goes bad, and perhaps other people suffer. Does that mean that we are to blame? If our motive was pure, if our intention was good, but the outcome is bad, is it still our fault? Perhaps the most difficult question that this story raises is the question of the boundaries of forgiveness. Does mercy have a limit? Does grace have an edge? Are there things that we can do? Is there disobedience that we can commit that is so far beyond the pale that it is a bridge too far for mercy to reach? Can we operate outside of the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness of God? Is that possible? Or to put the question in a cryptic fashion, do you think that Adolf Hitler is in heaven? Interested? Well, before we talk about it and I begin the story, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to embrace our freedom and trust in an all-knowing God. May we find in this paradox a true peace. I pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. The story that I want to tell you over the next 3 weeks is about a man named Judas Iscariot. The Hebrew name Judas means God is praised. And 2,000 years ago, in the first century in Israel, it was one of the most popular names for male children in all of Palestine. There were more boys named Judas than any other name that was given for over 100 years. You see, in 175 BC, the Seleucid Empire invaded Palestine, invaded Jerusalem, and the ruler of the Seleucid Empire was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. And in 175 BC, they invaded Jerusalem and threw the priests, the Jewish priests, out of the temple. And being aware that the greatest insult that he could lay on the Jewish people, Antiochus Epiphanes went into the holy place of the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar, defiling the temple. And he prohibited the Jews from having any public expressions of their worship on the Temple Mount. Eventually, a revolt undertook in 167 BC, a man named Mattathias Maccabees and his 4 sons, the most famous of which and heroic of which was named Judas Maccabees. They began a guerrilla war that lasted 3 years, but in 164 BC, they managed to overthrow the Seleucid, take back the Temple Mount, and over a course of 8 days, in the month of Kislev, they rededicated the temple and sanctified it and began offerings again in Jerusalem. In fact, Jewish people to this day celebrate the victory of the Maccabean revolt every year in what they call the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Hanukkah. It was a celebration of the victory of the Maccabees family, led by the oldest son, Judas Maccabees. Now, perhaps you don't know the story of Judas Maccabees, but I would guess that most of us are familiar with another man named Judas. He was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. We meet the 12 disciples in each of the synoptic gospels, in Matthew chapter 10, and in Mark chapter 3, and in Luke chapter 6. And in the lists in these 3 synoptic gospels, 9 of the 12 disciples have embellishments to their name. For example, we learn that the disciple named Simon was also named Peter, and he had a brother named Andrew. We learn that James and John were brothers, and they were the sons of Zebedee, and that Jesus gave them the nickname Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, not to be confused with Bojangles, which means sons of fried chicken. Thank you. The 8:30 service didn't laugh at that at all. But then there is Matthew the tax collector, and Simon the zealot, and James the son of Alphaeus. But only in Luke chapter 6 does it tell us that among the disciples there was another man named Judas, Judas the son of James. In the listing of the disciples in Matthew and Mark, Judas the son of James is identified not as Judas, but as Thaddeus. Most scholars believe that it is because Judas, who was known as the Iscariot, Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed his teacher, his Savior, the Messiah, that his name had become so damaged that the Judas, who was one of the other disciples, changed his name to Thaddeus. John, as he introduces us to the disciples, doesn't tell us the same way. He doesn't give us a list. He introduces the disciples to us over the course of time, individually or in small groups. And we meet Judas Iscariot. Iscariot basically means the son of Kerioth. And in John chapter 6, we meet his father. His name was Simon Iscariot. But in John chapter 6, and in John's chronology, the story of Jesus, by the time you get to John chapter 6, you've already gone through over 2 years of Jesus' public ministry. So that means by the time you got to John chapter 6, the 12 disciples, including Judas Iscariot, had seen Jesus literally heal hundreds, if not thousands of people. He had seen the blind see, and the deaf hear, and the mute speak. He had seen the lame walk. He had seen him calm the sea and control the waves. They had seen him walk on the water and feed the 5,000. They had even seen him raise the dead. They had heard his teaching every day for over 2 years, almost 2.5 years. They had been in his presence constantly. And they noticed that the religious leaders in Israel were becoming irritated by this young Galilean rabbi. And they were becoming increasingly antagonistic. And Jesus was pressing into that. And he was saying things that antagonized them. And in John chapter 6, Jesus says something completely outrageous. He says, "I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven." Now, Jesus knew exactly what he was referring to. He was referring to the famous story of the Exodus, where God sent manna every day to the people as they wandered in the wilderness, and it kept the people fed. It was the bread that came down from heaven. But Jesus says, I am the bread of life that has come down from heaven. And the religious leaders, they began to lose their minds at this statement. And they said, how can he say that he came down from heaven? We know his father Joseph, and we know he had a mother. We know that he was born. How can he possibly say that he came down from heaven? So Jesus doubles down. And he said, not only am I the bread of life that comes down from heaven, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have everlasting life. He goes on to explain that the manna that the people ate in the wilderness fed them, but they all eventually died. But if you eat his flesh and you drink his blood, you will live forever. And the disciples heard this, and they had been listening to him for 2.5 years, and they said, this is outrageous. You're starting to lose it here, wise teacher. You've gone completely off the reservation. This is too difficult. Who can possibly believe these things? And it says that Jesus knew this was hard. Jesus knew that this would be unacceptable for many, and he not only knew that there are many who could not believe this, he also knew that among his closest disciples, there was one who would choose to betray him. John chapter 6, verse 66 is one of the saddest verses in the Bible, John 6:66, where it says, in the watershed of this teaching, many of those who were following him decided they couldn't follow him any longer. They didn't understand this notion of cannibalism or whatever he was implying, and they left, and they didn't follow him anymore. And Jesus turns to his disciples, and he said, will you leave too? To which Peter replied, where will we go? You have the words of everlasting life. We chose to be with you. And then Jesus says, no, I chose you. And yet, one of you has chosen evil. One of you is the devil. And John, parenthetically, just so we won't be confused, just so we might not think that it was Simon Peter who denies him or Thomas who doubts him, he says, no, who he was talking about, the one who has chosen evil, the one who is side by side with the devil, is Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples. From the very first time we meet him, he is labeled a traitor. He is identified as a betrayer. Jesus says, I knew when I chose you that that's what you would do. And he doesn't know stuff like we know stuff. Oh, I knew that would happen. No, he knew. He knew this was going to happen. What chance did Judas have? Just on the face of it, it appears that Judas was destined for this, that he had no choice but to betray him. He was fashioned as a traitor. It was his legacy. It was his identity. It remains true to this day. If someone calls you a Judas, they are not paying you a compliment. They are calling you a traitor. They are calling you treasonous. And from the story of the life of Judas, it would appear that he had no choice. And we don't like that. No, that doesn't sit well with us. No, not at all. Because and it's not just because we're 21st century Americans and we're embedded in the notion of freedom. We as human beings have within us this idea that we have the opportunity, we have the capacity to choose our path. That life is a tabula rasa, that it is a blank canvas, that the story of our life is not yet written, and that we have the freedom to choose our own story, to choose our own path. And as we look around at the world that we live in, we know that this is true. Because we know that there are people who choose to make the world a better place. And because of their sacrifice and because of their effort and because of their choice, the world is a better place. And that down through human history, we can identify those individuals who made courageous and heroic and sacrificial choices for the benefits of others. And we have seen this take place in the fields of medicine and engineering and science and in relationships. We have seen this in the fields of engineering and the advancements that humans have made over the evolution of our society is because people have chosen to make their life and the life of the world that they live in better, not worse. And we have seen the reality and the truth that we have the opportunity, we have the responsibility, we have the capacity to choose our own path, to make our own way, to write our own story. And we embrace that. This is a good thing. This is a great thing. It establishes meaning in our life. It establishes significance. It's not just anthropologically and sociologically true, it's psychologically true. If we are just cogs in the wheel, we are just gears in the machine, we are just bricks in the wall, we are just following a predetermined narrative, then what do we matter? What do our choices matter if everything is already written out? There has to be value in our existence, and the value of our existence is manifested in our ability to choose our path. Because if we are simply playing out a destiny, then not only do my choices not matter, I don't matter. When I was a kid, in the summers, growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I looked forward to the carnivals that would roll through. We would have firemen's carnivals at these local volunteer fire departments, and then we'd have a county fair. But my favorite thing to do every summer was go to the largest amusement park near where I grew up. It was in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It was called Dorney Park. And I loved to go to Dorney Park because Dorney Park had a real wooden roller coaster, and it had tilt-a-whirls and scramblers and all kinds of games, and it was a magical place. But my favorite ride at Dorney Park was a ride called Road Rally. Because on the Road Rally ride, you could actually drive a car on a road. It was amazing. And when I was 5 or 6 years old, my grandfather used to put me on his lap, and I would steer the tractors. From as far back as I could remember, I was driving tractors and trucks and cars around the farm, but I couldn't drive on the road. But when I went to Dorney Park, I would get into this half-size car, and I could steer it. It would turn when I turned, and it would go when I pushed on the gas pedal. It was kind of awesome. But as I got a little bit older, I realized, hey, wait a minute. I'm not really driving this car. There's a metal rail that goes right down the middle, and I bump into that rail. And so when I was 7 or 8 years old and I realized, well, I'm not really driving, I thought it was like a contest where if I could drive it and not hit the rail, that'd be cool. But that lasted like half of the ride. And then it was boring again. I remember the last time I went on Road Rally, I went with my little brother, he was 3 or 4 years old. I put him on the seat and I said, Pete, watch this. And I took my hands off the wheel and floored it. And we just banged up against the rail, and we ran into the car in front of us. And when I say we ran into the car in front of us, we're doing like 1.5 miles an hour. But we got kicked off the ride, and he was crying, and I'm like, shh, the ride is lame. You don't want to ride on this? Because I don't want to just ride on the rail. I want to control my own destiny. I want my hands on the wheel to matter. And this is how we live our life. This is fashioned inside of us. We want to be in control. We want the opportunity and the responsibility to choose our own destiny, because that's when we know we are significant. That's when we know that our lives matter. But how much control do we really have? Our hands may be on the wheel, but are we just riding the rail? Take a moment and step back from our little narcissistic egocentric, we are the center of the universe point of view. And imagine for a minute, if you could gather every human being who has ever lived, billions of people, and you can gather them in one space, let's say a big space in the middle of Kansas. And you got all of the billions of people who ever lived, and we stood shoulder to shoulder, chest to back, gathered together in these square miles in the middle of Kansas, and up above us, a satellite took a picture of all of the faces of all of the people looking up at the satellite who had ever lived. I would defy you that you would become invisible in there. To find your face in among the billions of people that ever lived, if it wouldn't be impossible, it might take you the better part of your life to find yourself in there. And then imagine zooming out from that to where the earth would fit in between your fingers, and you couldn't even see the collection of people gathered in Kansas. You might just see some indication of something. And then you draw further back so that you can see the breadth of our solar system from the sun to Pluto. And the earth now has become an insignificant speck in the sky. And then you step back from where you're viewing our entire solar system to where you're viewing the entire Milky Way galaxy and the thousands and thousands of solar systems that make up that galaxy. You would be hard-pressed to identify our particular solar system. And if it were possible to step out to the edges of the universe, you would find that there's not just a galaxy, but there's an infinite number of galaxies. And you think you are in control? Imagine your life as a timeline. And that timeline, you have 100 years, let's say you are blessed to live 100 years. How much of that time do you spend sleeping? There goes a third of it. And nobody makes any progress in the first 20 years of their life, and nobody makes any progress in the last 20 years of your life. So now you're cutting the years that you have to make an impact down. And think of all of the time that you waste and all of the things that you do that are unproductive, or when you're struggling, or when you're just resting. And you've narrowed down that 100-year lifespan to a handful of years, and you place that handful of years as a pinpoint on a geological timeline. And the timeline extends from the time life began on this planet to the time that life will end on this planet. And there is no pin small enough to account for every day of our lives. And then you think about the context of our life. Did you choose who your parents were? Did you get to speak into the time when you were born, or the place where you were born? You didn't get to choose your race, or you didn't get to choose your shoe size or your foot size or the color of your eyes. God only knows I didn't choose this hairline. I didn't choose my DNA. We don't get a choice. Most of who we are, virtually everything we are, and if you believe modern neuroscientists, it's not just our biological traits, it's also our emotional and our physical capacities and our intellectual capabilities are encoded into our DNA, and we didn't get a say in that. We had no control over that. And our lives unwind as our DNA plays itself out, and we are just along for the ride. Would you choose to have the poverty riddle the world that we live in, the suffering and the struggle? Do you think that was some kind of a choice? Do you think cancer is a choice? How do you explain those things that happen where we are just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Where it is not our fault. I did nothing to deserve this. I did nothing wrong. I did not cause this to happen. This is not my fault. How do you put all of these things in perspective? You think you have control? Well, you have a choice. You have a choice to see the mystery of the world that we live in either as a divine conspiracy that is working together to a good end because of a loving and merciful God, or it's all just random. And we are just in a chain reaction of cause and effect that has begun at the beginning of the universe and will go into the infinite future. And all of the randomness and all of the mystery of life has no explanation. And the choice that we have is how we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves as victims of that cause and effect and that chain reaction that just puts us into this random circumstances where things happen to us and we are victimized without choice? Or are we part of a divine narrative, a meta-narrative, a story where every person has a place and every action has a purpose? And it's a divine conspiracy of good. That all of these things, even the things that we cannot understand, are working together for a reason, for a purpose, to a good end. So which is it? Are we sovereign, autonomous individuals given with the responsibility and the opportunity, the creativity to choose our own path? Is our life a tabula rasa on which we write our own narrative, or are we simply caught in the gears of the machine and that the universe is a cause and effect chain reaction of which we are one of the reactions and the cause of something else? Tell us, Dave, please tell us. We're looking for you to tell us. Okay. Yes. It's both. It has to be. It has to be both. Because both things are unassailably true. We are sovereign and free to make our choices. We are accountable and responsible. We have the opportunity to make the world a better or a worse place. It is within our capacity to do that. But we are also part of a divine narrative, a meta-narrative that moves through the mysterious cause and effect, always pointing to a reason and a purpose and a good end. And both things are absolutely true. And we don't like that. Our heads start to explode. It's like, no, that's logically inconsistent. You're breaking the rules. Who cares? Who said that's the rule? Who said it has to be one or other? Oh, I understand the laws of physics. And I understand that two objects cannot occupy exactly the same space at the same time. I understand the laws of logic. The two exact opposites cannot both be true. One has to be true and one has to be false. But what if there is a rule above the rules, a law above the laws, that says when we are in the middle of the life where we have these incredible opportunities to make the world a better place, it is on us to do it. It is our opportunity and our capacity and our responsibility to make the world a better place, not worse. And we are free, sovereign individuals. It is ours to choose. And at the exact same time, in the mystery and the uncertainty and the ambiguity of the universe, we can have absolute confidence that there is a reason and there is a purpose and that God is at work working all things together for good. And we can believe both of those things are true. How do I know that? Because of the story of Judas. You see, at the center of the story of Judas is the story of Jesus. And the Bible makes no apologies for claiming that Jesus was, in every way as we are, 100% human. That he was as vulnerable and he was as frail and he was as fragile. He was as subject to the laws of the universe as we are. That he got hungry and he got tired and he cried and he felt the pain of this life. That he was tempted in every way as we are. He was 100% like us. And yet at the exact same time, he was uncompromised in his deity. He knew in that moment everything that was and everything that is and everything that would be. And he had at his full disposal the power that created everything. He was uncompromised in his identity as 100% God, fully human and fully divine. And he gives us a theological wink in John chapter 6. When he says to his disciples, I have chosen you. And yet, at the same time, one of you has chosen evil. One of you is the devil. You see, Judas gives us permission to believe that both are true, because he was destined to be the traitor, but he also chose to betray his master. See, the story of Judas Iscariot is a fascinating story. It is a story of how this man who walked with Jesus and lived with Jesus and saw all the miracles of Jesus decided that he would betray him. And yet from the very beginning, that was his destiny. He was both, as we are both. Part of a greater story, part of something well beyond our own understanding, and yet totally responsible and accountable and capable of making a choice to make the world a better place or a worse one. It is the story of Judas Iscariot that prompts us to ask this question. How do these things coexist? Is it possible that we are completely free? And is it possible that God is in complete control? Yes. Next week, we'll wrestle with the next most difficult question, the question of intent, the question of motive. Have you ever started off wanting something to go well, and it was your intention that things would turn out well, but for one reason or another they go badly, and maybe some people suffer, some people are hurt, the damage is done, but you didn't intend that. That wasn't your motive. This was not what you were thinking, but this happened anyway. How do we come to terms with that? Am I still to blame? Is it still my fault? Do I still blame you, even though you never intended to harm me? This is the question we press into next week. Because these are the questions that are raised in this story. This is a fascinating story. A story of intrigue, and a story of love, and a story of hate, a story of loyalty, and a story of betrayal. The story of Judas Iscariot. And what makes the story of Judas so fascinating is not simply because it's an archetypal story, and it's like a story that has been repeated as long as stories have been told. And it's not that the characters are iconic and we recognize what it means to be loyal and what it means to be disloyal. We recognize these people with different names. The reason that the story of Judas is so important is because the story of Judas is our story.